folks. The problem is we got Face the Nation on TV today talking about the Taliban. Taliban and the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. Taliban is not Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda attacked us on 9/11. Bin Laden. Al Qaeda is the base for jihad, was bin Laden's base for jihad. It was run out of Afghanistan, out of the mountains, out of the volcanoes that he had bulldozed cities inside of. His father had died, left him $600 million in a construction company. He used the bulldozers to build tunnels and cities underground. So he attacked us on 9/11. The Taliban is tribes in Afghanistan. Afghanistan had the Soviets there for 10 years, and we helped bin Laden defeat the Soviets. We gave him weapons that the Israelis had captured in wars with Arab countries that had got the weapons from Russia, because we didn't want to use our weapons, because we didn't want the Russians to know we were involved. You see Charlie Wilson's war with Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts, and you see how we were aiding $1 billion worth of anti-tank guns and, or what do you call them, phalanx cannons, and anti-tank guns. Let's say Stinger missiles to shoot down the helicopters, and phalanx cannons to blow up the tanks. So there was all kinds of weapons we sent over. So there was all kinds of Taliban tribes. There were Taliban tribes that supported Al Qaeda, and there's Taliban tribes that didn't support Al Qaeda. So you weren't going to kill 32 million Pashtuns. I think 18 million of them were in Afghanistan, or in Pakistan. So many million, let's say 20 million in whatever. Half of them, say the half were in Afghanistan, half in Pakistan. And then eventually Bush W. quit hunting for bin Laden for 2 years and gave up on him. So we tracked him down through his assistant's cell phone under Obama, and then they sent a what was it, a SEAL team or Delta Force over there, somebody, I think it was SEALs, to kill him. So, and he was married, had 4 wives and 100 children, and wished he'd died in Afghanistan fighting the Soviets. But I think CIA gave him $26 million in 2 training camps, and Clinton almost got him with a Tomahawk missile. They had this tall guy walking around somewhere over there, and we missed him. But they say Bill Clinton didn't fight terrorism. That's bullshit, because Clinton was preaching against terrorism when he was president. It's just that we don't take it seriously. So the problem is that in 1921, U.S. Congress severely restricted Polish-Jewish immigration, and in 24, there was 3 million Polish Jews that wanted to come over here. We didn't let them come, and eventually Hitler killed them. He killed 91% of the Jews in Poland, and the Israelis are still mad about the Holocaust, and they don't trust us because they think we will make a deal with the Arabs over oil. So what's the problem? The problem is that that Allen Dulles, the first director of CIA, signed or hired 4,000 Nazis to work for the CIA in 1947. So as soon as Truman signed the NSA bill, and all Truman wanted was a summary of his daily intelligence report, as soon as he signed the bill, Allen Dulles hired 4,000 Nazis. It was a crooked lawyer with his brother, John Foster Dulles. And together they overthrew 9 governments, including Guatemala, Guam, Iran, and 53. They put the president-elect Mossadegh in a prison where he died, and he was going to nationalize the oil in Iran. And we didn't want that to happen. Norman Schwarzkopf's father was in CIA in Tehran, and Norman was in Tehran when he was a boy. Together, I mean, his father and the CIA overthrew that government. That later caused the problem with the Ayatollah coming into power in the 80s, and actually starting in the 70s, I guess, in the hostage crisis. Jimmy Carter made a big, grave mistake by by attacking the students holding the hostages. And I hear Ollie North and Norman Schwarzkopf were in charge of that operation where the helicopters collided in the desert in a sandstorm and killed 8 Marines, and they blamed that on Jimmy Carter. Carter would have to be a fool anyway to attack hostage holders, because I thought when he did it, they would just kill the hostages. So it was stupid. But anyway, the deal that was made was with Bush Sr. and Reagan to trade arms for hostages. Reagan claims he didn't know about it, but the other deal was that they wouldn't be released till the day Reagan was elected president or inaugurated president. And Bush Sr. was in the loop. He claims he was not in the loop. Bush Sr. was one of the biggest liars that ever lived. They just buried him after he whitewashed the FBI report that says that he was in charge of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Nixon wanted to kill Castro as soon as he found out he's a communist in 1959. And Nixon was in charge of the CIA Black Op 40, according to Howard Hunt's son. Howard Hunt told his son before he died that the CIA Op number 40, and in charge of which was George Herbert Walker Bush and Richard Nixon. Bush denied he was in the CIA in 61. Actually, there was 2 G.H.W. Bushes in the CIA in 61, and one was a lowly clerk and couldn't have been in charge. The other was Bush Sr. himself. Also, he lied about bailing out and leaving the 2 co-pilots in the co-pilot navigator in the Liberator in World War II. When you bail out of a Liberator, you pull the cockpit back over your head. That locks the other 2 guys back in. He didn't let them. They should have got out first, and he didn't let them do it. And back when he was running for president, some guys that were flying with him. He was the youngest pilot in the Navy. He was 18 when he was in the Navy. He bailed out when his plane was smoking. He claimed it was on fire. They said it wasn't on fire. It was just smoking. But they let it go. He claims he saw the 2 chutes when he got out. He said he broke his nose hitting the tail end of the plane. I guess it reminds you of the saying, don't let the door hit you in the ass when you leave. It's too bad it didn't cut his head off, because he later was head director of CIA in 76 when he masterminded the camera bombing of a Cuban airliner coming back from the Olympics. And either 76 or 79 people were killed. 2 camera bombs were put on the plane in Barbados, which took off for Venezuela. And I guess Venezuela was going to go to Cuba. So anyway, it blew up and killed the 34 teenage member of their fencing team. And the 2 guys who put the bombs on were later pardoned when Bush Sr. was president. They were harbored here in the U.S., and they died eventually here. But the Miami-Dade County Cubans, by the way, were in charge of fixing the 2000 election to make it look like Bush Jr. won the election, which he did not do. And the Democrats had control of the House and the Senate. All they had to do was abolish the Electoral College after, if you remember, Bush Jr. won the election 2000 by, I think, 1 or 4 electoral votes. And West Virginia used to be a Democrat state, used to have 4 congressmen. I think it lost a congressman that only has 3 or 2. Anyway, it's lost population since World War II. It doesn't have 2 million people. And it turned Republican. It went from 4-1 Democrat to 3-1 or 3-2 Republican. I can't remember, but W. Bush won West Virginia by campaigning in Beckley, which had never been campaigned in before. This is not the capital. It's kind of a backwater. Well, the whole state of West Virginia, the people, there's some beautiful scenery there, but the people are philosophically in the Middle Ages. It's about 500 years. If you go back 500 years, I mean, you had the Renaissance, in the 1500s or something. I guess the Dark Ages were just before that. So this is the year 2000. You would have to go back about 600 years now to the Dark Ages. But that's about where West Virginia is. It makes 85% of the national average in income. It spends 85% of the national average in education. It's not a good place to raise children because the educational system isn't very good. And B.F. Skinner had a daughter who used to teach at West Virginia U, where they teach behavioral science, which is a racket. It's based on the idea that you can indoctrinate animals like you can indoctrinate people, or you can condition people like you condition animals. You cannot indoctrinate an animal. You cannot condition a person. Animals are not on the level of concepts. So some guy tried to tell me one day that dolphins are smarter than people. I've never seen a dolphin write a book. I've never read the equivalent of Shakespeare in dolphin lingo. Maybe they do speak. I'm sure whales speak. Sure they have some kind of communication. They have a brain. Probably whales are smarter than dolphins. I don't know. Anyway, the oceans are dying, by the way. They're becoming acidic, and you need to get the pH back to neutral because fish can't live in acidic water. And you've got 2 sources of acid. You've got the carbon dioxide turns into carbonic acid, and then you've got the sulfur dioxide from the volcanoes. There's sulfur, I don't know if you know, there's kind of a shortage of sulfur, but they get sulfur from volcanoes. And that's part of the problem with volcanic gases. And then Hawaii, they were talking about the mix of the gases with the water. When you mix sulfur dioxide with water, you get some form of sulfuric acid, either sulfurous acid or something. Sulfuric acid is H2SO4. There's I think a H2SO3, and then you have like bleach has some kind of Clorox is some kind of I think it's not acidic. I mean, it's not sulfuric acid. It's hydrochloric, but you have different kinds of different kinds of acids, different strengths. You have a very strong acid, and then you have weak acid like acetic acid, which is carboxylic acid, and carbonic acid is, I guess, a little weaker, but fish cannot live in that water, and I don't know how you're going to neutralize all the water in the world. In high school, you could take ammonium chloride and neutralize, it's a base, it's a buffer. It forms ammonium ion and a chloride ion. HCl is hydrogen chloride. If you combine ammonia with hydrochloric acid, you're going to have a very strong reaction, but NH3, but NH4 with HCl makes H2O, and then you get NH, some kind of, it's a buffer. So you have NH4 dissociates in NH3 and a hydrogen ion, or it's an NH4 minus, and then you have H plus from the hydrogen chloride. So that's H plus and the H minus combines to neutralize, make a H2. So you get hydrogen, I guess. I can't remember the reaction. I just know that you can neutralize it. I think everybody in the world would have to take a bucket of ocean water and neutralize it and put it back in the ocean. Maybe that would eventually neutralize the oceans, or you'd have to have some kind of plant that sucks in the water, neutralizes it, and puts it back in the ocean without killing the fish. But believe me, the oceans are dying. They're 75 or 80% empty. The oil spills have killed a lot of fish. And then there's the silt runoff from deforestation that has killed the coral reefs. And between the global warming up the water, I just saw yesterday an old rawhide show where a guy's trying to bring Chad fish to California from the East Coast. The Chad could only live below 80-degree water temperature. So I go to a heated swimming pool. It's 84 degrees. It seems cold to me. 80 degrees you think is warm. Air 70 degrees you think is supposed to be relatively warm. 80 degrees you think is hot. 80-degree water is not really hot. Your body is 96.8, right? So if you get in 80-degree water, it's going to cool you off. So I guess that's why people swim in the ocean. However, the fish are dying, and some fish are extinct. And between the acid and the heat and everything else, for a while there, and also we'd overfished. I think bluefin tuna was overfished and was down to 2%. So they were fishing yellowfin. Now they found bluefin have come back since the water's heated up. Anyway, so they're now fishing bluefin tuna again. But you've got so much plastic pollution in the ocean, so much oil. And Jacques Cousteau went around the world in the Calypso before he died and said ocean couldn't take much more of this pollution. Much more oil spills. And then he had the BP oil spill after he died. And then I saw where a bunch of dolphins sucked in oil down in the Gulf and died. And we just had a Hurricane Dora stirring up the Atlantic, but there was a Gulf Coast, the current from the equator that warms the North America, goes up the Gulf Stream. That current is dying. You've got so much ice has melted from Greenland. It's cooled off the ocean. And, well, that's interesting. We're talking about global warming and then cooling off the Gulf Stream. That's going to put North America into an ice age. And by the way, let's talk about global warming a minute. You have the Earth was going into an ice age until the 1970s when the air pollution from all the automobiles, all the not nitrate, let's see, was it NO2s, or you had all kinds of gases coming off from these cars. It wasn't just carbon dioxide; it was nitrous oxide or nitrogen oxide. You had kind of like a stew of gases, and that formed this layer around the Earth. Also, the aerosols were killing off the ozone layer. So you had this problem with this hole in the ozone layer. They switched to, they got rid of tetrafluorocarbons or whatever that were dissolving the ocean. Interacting with the ozone, which is O3. But supposedly that is healing, but I don't think it's quite healed. However, it has healed quite a bit, but then something else is turning it back. I don't think they quit using aerosols. There's some place in China that's still producing aerosols. That is now reversing this healing of the ozone layer. So you're going to get all kinds of radiation from that. It's very dangerous and can cause skin cancer and all that. By the way, on the average age of death, hundreds of years ago, one woman out of every three given childbirth died, and you had a lot of infant deaths. So when you averaged an age like 0 with 100, you got an average age of 50. They talk about the average age of death was 45 or something. Now it's 75. Supposedly that's because of increase in medical care. That's bullshit. People die at 70, 80, 90, just like they used to do. Some die at birth, but like Cuba, for example, had like a 1 in 1,000 deaths, infant deaths, had the lowest infant mortality rate in the world. Although we always denigrate Cuba, that is a mistake. By the way, Kennedy was going to pull out of Cuba the day he died. He had a man down there telling Castro he's going to normalize trade and drop the blockade. Kennedy had signed an order to pull out of Vietnam. He and McNamara had come out with after years of interrogating Vietnamese, they found out that they were fighting for their homeland and freedom like we fought the British in the American Revolution. And Ho Chi Minh actually was allied with us in World War II to get rid of the Japanese. So he'd gotten elected president after the war, and then de Gaulle wanted Vietnam back as a colony. He had fought the French colonialists during the 30s when the Japanese overran Vietnam in the 40s. Then he was fighting Japanese when we were bombed in Pearl Harbor, and I think we had a blockade around Japan at the time, cut off their oil, so they attacked Pearl Harbor. That really was a horrible war, and we haven't gotten over it since. But what the people don't know is that the CIA had 4,000 Nazis in it, and that Hitler wanted to keep fighting the Soviets by creating a famine to starve 40 million Soviets to death and enslave the other 90 million. And NATO was created basically because of the Cold War, which started when this German master spy against the Soviets, General Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's master of spies, the man without a face, the most dangerous man in Europe, who was in charge of interrogating 4 million Soviet POWs who were systematically starved, then tortured and shot after they talked or didn't talk, one or the other. But they would put food in front of them, tell them if they didn't talk, they would starve to death. And that's basically how they starved 4 million of them to death. So 2 million were gassed in Poland with diesel exhaust, which will kill you in about 15 minutes, which is a very bad way, horrible way to die if you've ever smelled that stinking diesel exhaust. And it's a carcinogen, and it was going to be labeled by OSHA as a carcinogen when Bush Jr. got in, and then he didn't let them do that. So anyway, so since the 47, we've had Nazis in the CIA. Descendants of their Nazis went to Arab countries, formed ultra right-wing death squads, and then the Israelis came over here because we've really systematically become Nazified since World War II, since the Dulles brothers helped launder Hitler's stolen billions. And NATO basically right now wants to go to war with Russia. It's really run by neo-Nazis over there, and the EU was created by the CIA. And Kennedy, when he signed the order to pull out of Vietnam and dismantle the CIA, the order went out from CIA to kill Kennedy. So it was a black op by the CIA, and you've got books by Mark Lane was supposed to be Oswald's lawyer. Oswald was the patsy, the fall guy. It was a Sicilian-style hit, according to Sam Giacomo, who ran the Chicago mob. And so you can see my Facebook page, Who Wanted Kennedy, Who Wanted JFK Dead, and the JFK Murder Solved by the Books. Between Jesse Ventura interviewing E. Howard Hunt's son, and Mark Lane, who wrote Rush to Judgment, which refutes the Warren Commission's report, and Alan Dulles was put on that commission And that whole report is a lie, was just made up to try to frame Oswald. And Hoover was part of the frame up. The mafia had pictures of Hoover as a cross dresser. He was extremely anti communist. And the word out in the CIA was Kennedy was to kill Castro. So they basically decided to kill Kennedy and blame it on Castro. So Castro was the fall guy, which I don't think he ever knew, but that was what the deal. I always heard they blamed it on the Marxists, but it turns out, who's a Marxist? You have the communists in Russia, and you had the Red Chinese, and then you had the Castro. And it's like a famous. I mean, they tried to kill Castro through 9 presidents. The CIA was not able. And they wanted the mafia to do it. The mafia couldn't do it. Nobody did it. He died at 90-something, and his brother took over. People hated Castro's guts because they thought because he was blamed, because Cuba was allied with Russia. It's a long story, but basically, let me just start over saying Tom Brokaw, who says Kennedy was gung-ho on Vietnam till the day he died, is full of shit. Tom Brokaw, years ago, when Reagan was president, he was so pro-Reagan. Everything Reagan did. Reagan borrowed $4 trillion for the biggest military buildup in peacetime in world history. The real hero of World War II was Dwight D. Eisenhower. He invaded France. He didn't want to go to war with Russia or China, wanted peaceful uses of space. He balanced the budget all 8 years he was president. He built the interstates with the gasoline tax. He didn't sell bonds to build the interstate. Jim Wright talked him into using a gas tax. That gas tax helped balance the budget for years until they took it off the books. Took it off. That was being put in the general revenue for balancing the books. It was a mistake. So we should have been working on our roads all those years. And, Obama came in saying he was going to get out of Iraq. Okay, we're still in Iraq. Nothing has changed, really. Obama turned into a war president. Both parties are now war parties. NATO wants to go with war with Russia. Israel wants to bomb Iran, which is allied with Russia, which is a nuclear power, which is strategically allied with China, which has together, they have 2,000 ICBMs. And by the way, China, years ago, we had a Chinese rocket scientist building our ICBMs, and the FBI was tailing this guy, following him so much, it was driving him crazy. He told them, if you don't quit following me, I'm going to defect to China. And they wouldn't quit following him, so he defected to China. So they got our top missile expert. This is years, like 50 years ago. And he started building ICBMs. And so now they've got the same ICBMs we got. By the way, let's talk about the space program for a minute, because Werner von Braun was born in 1912, within 3 months, I think, of the day that the Titanic sank, which is a bad omen. But he had royalty on both sides of his family. And in Germany, back when he was a boy in the 20s, sometime there was a book about interplanetary space travel. Him and his friends read it, and they formed a club, and he wanted to do interplanetary space travel. So, and then eventually he ended up becoming a PhD in physics, and he learned how to make rockets. And they used to study our liquid fuel rocket scientist, Goddard, who was making, I think in 29, he had a rocket. But von Braun and his father went to see the rocket cars in Tempelhof Air Dome when he was about 12, so I guess it was about 1924. Max Valier and Fritz Opel had rocket cars that ran on liquid fuel, alcohol, and something. some kind of oxidizer. I don't know if it's hydrazine or I don't know. Could have been anything. Yeah, I think it was. I think it was pure H2O2. But anyway, sometimes they blew up. But von Braun wanted a rocket car. His father wouldn't buy him a rocket car, so he took his little red wagon down to some street in Berlin near a movie theater and tied some Chinese rockets on it and lit them. And it went down the street, flying down the street, and ran into this crowd of people at the theater. So police were called. They came and put him in jail. His father had to go down to jail, bail him out. And he never would use solid fuel after that. So he built the Saturn V when he brought 300 German rocket scientists over here. He built the V1, the V2 over there. The V2 would go about 400 miles. It was liquid fuel. It weighed 19 tons. It had a 1-ton warhead. I guess it was TNT. And they blitzed England, but Hitler just thought it was a bunch of noise. He didn't finance the V2 early in the war. If he would have probably won the war. But they attacked England in 40. The Japs bombed us in 41, invaded the Philippines the day after they bombed us in Pearl Harbor, and we went to war with Japan. World War II for us was basically a war against Japan. Then Mussolini's black shirts trained Hitler's Nazis on how to kill communists and humiliate people and torture them and all that. They used to give them, what is that, fish oil? What is it? Oh, castor oil. Used to like force castor oil down these people and cause them all kinds of intestinal problems, and then photograph them with manure all over them, and they would humiliate them, put their pictures in the paper. It was a terrible time. They also liked to hang people. Somehow thought that was humiliating. I guess it is. I have never been hung. I heard people dance at the end of the rope. I know it cuts off your oxygen. Usually it breaks your neck when you fall, and that usually kills you. So it is a bad way to die. I mean, there is no good way to die, as Camus says, as far as he's seen. Death absolves people of all their mistakes. However, some of these Nazis, I don't think will ever be absolved. In fact, it's ruined the reputation of the German people, who had some brilliant people, but even Einstein, who thought there could be a world government, didn't have any political education. You can never have a one world government. Look at it this way. You've got 1.5 billion Chinese. They think the Africans are still living in trees, that they're descended from monkeys, et cetera, et cetera. They don't think they have washing machines or civilization in Africa. I mean, as far as that goes, the human race, they think archaeologists, or what do you call them, anthropologists, that the first man was African. But and then there was a super volcano in Africa some hundreds of thousands of years ago, or 60,000, I don't know exactly when, I wasn't alive, but it wiped out 70% of the human genome. And so we're supposed to all be descended from the 30% that survived that volcano. So that means we all have the same DNA. And by the way, I read Lauren Isley's book on Darwin's Century. If you read that book on the evolution of the theory of evolution and Darwin's Century, you'll find out that, Darwin's Century and the Voyage of the Beagle by Darwin, where he's talking about going to these different islands on this boat called the Beagle, and you'd have birds on one island with short beaks and birds on another island with longer beaks, and the longer the beaks they had, the better they could survive. And he said that the short beak birds died out because they didn't reproduce. It's, the way the survival of the fittest works is not the survival of the strongest. It's the ones who adapt to the environment so that they survive which is why you have Clint Eastwood's famous three words: adapt, improvise, and overcome. That's the trick. You've got to adapt, and also it's why situation ethics is valid. People don't think situation ethics is valid. They think you have to have some absolute moral rules that are eternal or something. There's no sentence or rule that you can follow in every situation because every situation is different. You have to adapt, improvise, and overcome. You have to adjust to every situation. And we are in a bad situation right now. We are now broke. We don't owe 20 trillion. And by the way, Ron Paul and Rand Paul, they keep talking about 20, 21 trillion. If we just owed 21 trillion, we would be all right. That's what the market's assuming. That's what Trump assumes, that can be fixed. That can't. We don't owe 21 trillion. The banks owe 552 trillion. And let's talk about trillion a minute. A million is 1,000 thousand. It's 6 zeros. So a billion is 9 zeros. That's 1,000 million. Okay. A trillion is a million million. Okay. So we're talking about 552 million dollars. Can you imagine? Okay, imagine you have $1 million. That's hard to imagine. It's 1,000 thousand. That's not too hard to think about. $1,000 bills. Think about $1,000 bills, and then think 10 million is $10,000 bills. Okay, and 100,000 million. Okay, well, 1,000 million is a billion. Okay, so if you had $1,000,000 bills, that's a lot of $1,000 bills. Okay, that's $1 trillion. Now, back when a dollar, you have to also now think about the dollar. Back in 1906, I heard once that you could eat all day on 10 cents, that you could eat breakfast for a nickel. Okay, let's talk about breakfast for a nickel. You go to McDonald's. I used to go to McDonald's for about $10. I could get a big breakfast. Now I don't know if it's $15 or $16 or $20. I haven't eaten a big breakfast in a long time. I don't have a car. I used to walk, and then I had an operation. I have trouble walking now, so I'm disabled. But I still can walk. It's just it's hard. My legs now are swollen. My feet are swollen. I'm not as healthy as I used to be, but I need to get back in shape. And so I'm doing these stretches, by the way, with, if you watch Miranda Esmond White, she used to be a ballerina, broke her foot. Now she does these stretches where she stretches every muscle in her body, 620 muscles or something. And she keeps moving all the time. And it's funny because the Bahamas just got destroyed, but she was down there. She was in Mexico. She was all over the Caribbean doing these exercises, and she's wonderful to keep you stretching. You're stretching your arms, you're stretching your legs, you're stretching your fingers, your toes. You go to a nursing home, you see all these people sitting around. Some people can't move their fingers. It's ridiculous. So, they just, what did they do their whole life? They must have just, if you sit and you don't stretch and you don't exercise and you don't walk, your legs, your muscles atrophy. And turns out the connective tissue also gets tighter somehow. And I heard about this, had this teacher's sister died who couldn't breathe. She was on oxygen for 2 years. I couldn't imagine someone not smoking, not being able to breathe. But it turns out if you don't stretch your lungs, take big breaths and stretch your arms out and do all kinds of stretching exercises and stretch your backbone and stretch every part of your body every day. She does different muscles different days, but it improves your posture, it improves your health, and you just got to keep moving. But anyway, how do we get off on that? That, along with Dr. Furman's diet, I think is the solution to the health crisis in this country. Has a plant vegetable diet. It's 5% meat and fish. It's not a pure vegan diet. It's reducing the the meat protein to 5%. We eat too much meat. I guess, too much meat. Meat protein and fish protein doesn't really have any micronutrients, the minerals and the vitamins and stuff that plants have that you need to really nourish your body. So, by the way, there's two kinds of people in the world: the toxic, neo-Nazi, unhappy people who want to punish people. By the way, Nietzsche says, "Beware of the people whose desire to punish is strong," and the happy, nourishing people. So, stay away from the unhappy, toxic people. Stay around the happy, nourishing people, and you'll get happier and happier and happier. While I'm on that subject, I gotta go. We need to be teaching self-defense to children K through 12. We need to. Dr. Phil has a son who goes around the high schools talk about getting rid of bullying by having everybody unite against the bullies. You know, sometimes things happen to people when they get isolated out in the middle of nowhere, or something. They get surrounded by certain people who, like that boy out west somewhere that was homosexual who got tied to a fence where they killed him. Some gang in Cleveland or something cut a boy, tore him to pieces because he was wearing a leather jacket. They stole his jacket and took him apart with pliers and hammers and something. I don't know. It was horrible, horrible. There's some horrible people out there. By the way, there's a proverb or something that says, "Go out of your way to avoid fools." And Da Vinci said, "Where there's much noise, there's little knowledge." You could accuse me of that because I'm talking so much, but it takes an awful lot of theory to put a rocket on the moon. You can't do it with just your emotions. And let's talk about the moon. Now we'll go back to that subject. To go to the moon, von Braun in the 55 designed this system. You have a moon rocket, and he had the Saturn V. Went to the moon with the Saturn V. It's a 3-stage liquid fuel rocket. You can turn the liquid fuel on and off, and you could steer it. Also had retro rockets, which you could slow it down. So when you landed on the moon, you could stop your fall, your free fall, which you will crash into the moon if you don't turn on the retro rockets. And he could, once we got a rocket in orbit, and John Glenn went into orbit in 65, but he went on an ICBM, didn't go on a Saturn V. He went up on a military missile. And von Braun built military missiles. In fact, we confiscated 187 boxcar loads of V2 rocket parts, engines, and fuselages at the end of World War II, and we used that to start our Redstone rocket program in the 50s, 40s, and 50s. And when the Russians put Sputnik up, Sputnik 1 and 2, which was just a little ball that beeped and went around the Earth, and then they put a mouse in space and a dog in space and a monkey in space, and you had the people over here scared to death. I wasn't scared to death. In 52, I was born. I'm 7 months older than Putin, whose brother had an older brother that died in Leningrad. The Nazis cut off the railroad tracks to supply Leningrad to try to starve 2 million people to death, which I guess his brother ended up being one of those, but he never met his older brother. When you look at Putin, I'm not afraid of that man. I really think, in fact, he's better educated than Trump. He's not an idiot. I've never heard of him. As far as I know, the Israelis are trying to frame him to make it look like he's some kind of madman. And they did the same thing to Saddam Hussein. Said he was a madman, killed people with his bare hands and all that crap. That he was going to go nuclear and take all the oil in the Middle East. We've got Israeli spies over here under deep cover out of Canada, the Canadian consulates in Montreal and Toronto. These guys are Mossad within the Mossad. They get on the cocktail circuits in D.C. and New York City, which they consider their playground. they've got a building somewhere in New York and Manhattan where they run out their operations out of, but they also have safe houses all over the world, and they hire legitimate foreign graduate students. They pay $1,000 a month to rent an apartment or house, and they send a young guy officer around to keep it stockpiled, and they always are meeting in safe houses. They don't really use the embassy, but they control the diplomatic pouch in the embassies in the basement in the embassy, and they are running drugs across the Southwest U.S., including cocaine and heroin. So um, Trump wants to shut down the Mexican border. These guys coming in out of Canada with perfectly forged U.S. passports from Montreal, from the Israeli consulates in Montreal and Toronto. So, and also the Israelis run these phony businesses out of Canada, 80% of their phony businesses, where they send a guy somewhere in the world and he has a so-called business partner in Canada, some guy with a phone, a letterhead. The taxes are paid on these businesses. There's boxes full of these prepaid businesses on the shelf in this building in Tel Aviv, where if they want to start a company and they want to put an agent somewhere, they put the one guy in Canada to answer the phone and stuff, and the other guy they send anywhere in the world. So he has the business cards. He hands you the card. It says call this number. You call that number, and the guy in Canada is answering. That guy is working for the Israeli Mossad. So they are in control of the U.S. Congress by way of blackmail, bribery, and coercion. They have the biggest lobby in D.C. Israel's the only country that has a lobby in D.C. And they forged or falsified their 62 or 61 tax form to get religious status for AIPAC, the America Israel Public Affairs Committee. There's only 2% of the electorate in the U.S. is Jewish, but the Israelis don't give a damn about the Jews, and that electorate at 2% is divided between pro-war and anti-war. The Mossad wants war. It doesn't want peace. It wants a war, unconditional surrender. It started the war in 1967, where they took the Sinai Desert, the Gaza Strip from Egypt. They preemptively struck Egypt after they went around Israel, blowing up stuff, making it look like Egypt did it. They made the Arabs angry, when the Arabs got ready to attack, they preemptively struck Egypt. They took that land, and then they were getting ready to. They told Jordan that Egypt conquered Israel. So when Jordan sent troops into Israel, they took the West Bank, and they don't plan on ever giving it back. So, and they're getting ready to do the same thing to Jordan to take the Golan Heights, when we told them we heard them lying to Egypt. And when we told them what we heard, and we had an electronic surveillance ship, the NSA had this electronic spy ship off the coast, 12 miles off the coast of Tel Aviv in the international waters. It was not armed except with 50 caliber machine guns, and the Mossad got angry and they sent bombers to bomb it, and they killed 34 Americans and wounded over 170. And you can look up the USS Liberty here on on YouTube, excuse me, and you will see that they did that, and the survivors are talking about it. They shot down the radar equipment and all this, the antennas. They had to climb up, put antennas back up. They sent in torpedo boats with machine guns to fire on our life rafts and the guys trying to put out the fire with fire hoses. So I think if Trump knew, by the way, Donald, if you're listening, if you find out that the Israelis killed 34 Americans and said it was an accident, the guys on that ship, the survivors, don't think it was an accident because they had our frequencies. They knew it was us. They shot down 2 of our flags, by the way, Donald. And the captain put up an 8 foot by 13 foot, which your Star Spangled Banner was an 8-foot by 13-foot flag we put up when the British shelled the fort in Baltimore. So, and by the way, that the America the Beautiful should be the national anthem, not the Star Spangled Banner. If you ever read anything, Donald, Edith Hamilton said that in the 40s we were gung ho on war. We detested. She detested war. She talks about Agamemnon talking about war tradesmen for gold. It meets where the spear points clash, the dogs of war, and all that. The Star Spangled Banner talks about bombs bursting in the air, the rocket's red glare. She just detested it. And she was a great Greek scholar. And I think she read Gibbons when she was little. Her father went to Oxford. He taught her Latin and Greek when she was a little girl. So she read Gibbons in the original Latin. And by the way, she said that whenever Gibbons wanted to say anything about sexual Roman practices of sex, he put it in the margin. In Latin, she learned everything she learned about sex from Gibbons. But the KKK lobbied to get the Star Spangled Banner to become the national anthem in 1931. So if you know, by the way, Woodrow Wilson was a racist who fired all the blacks in Washington, D.C. When he came to office. I always thought, it was great that we had a Democrat in office at the turn of the century, et cetera, et cetera. He did keep us out of World War I until 1917. It started in 1914, but the Germans started sinking our ships again, and we were making some kind of deal with Mexico or somebody to go to war with us. So we went to war, but we beat them in 2 years. Actually, we went in 17. We sent 2 million men over to France, and we knocked the shit out of them. But Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, lost a son. His baby son was shot down by the Germans in a plane over, I guess it was over Germany. Anyways, over German lines. And his first 2 sons had gone in and got wounded, and he kept glorifying these sons. And so his last son went in and got killed, and he died 6 months later of a broken heart. So that's a strange thing about Teddy Roosevelt. They don't really talk about in history that a man can die of a broken heart, and you can also die of loneliness. So then there's a lot of isolated people in the United States. By the way, Donald Trump said before he was president, Donald, you can remember this. You said you kept yourself isolated because you're afraid someone was going to steal all your money. Well, you're now isolated. The definition of a despot, a despotic will, is an isolated individual will, an unchallenged will. And you were captain of a football team in your military high school where, or your father sent you for discipline. So, and you always have been a horn dog. So you met your first wife overseas. I don't know where you met Marla Maples, but you weren't married to her long. Like you said, you settled for 26 million for your first marriage. You were married 12 years. It wore out. You were over in Europe running around with beauty queens or something. And your third wife is from overseas, and your mother is from Scotland. And I actually think that's your problem. My mother her name was York, and she was born here, but her mother was Irish, and I'm English, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. I've got the McPherson clan in my family tree, which is the biggest clan in Scotland. I don't really know what clan your mother was from, but my mother admired Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Eisenhower balanced the budget all 8 years. Reagan was just an actor from Hollywood who really turned this country into the biggest debtor nation on earth. It was the biggest creditor nation until Reagan came in. We owed $1 trillion. It took us 250 years to reach $1 million in debt. But he cut the tax base for 90% of the federal budget in 81 with the biggest tax cut in history. And I don't see how your tax cut can be bigger than Reagan's, because look at Eisenhower's tax rate on the rich was 90%. And Reagan cut it down to wherever it was when you came in. So that cut 90% of the tax base. It cut the tax base from the Mississippi to California as far as out of the budget. So that, and all the states had to then, I mean, the onus was put on the states for all these federally mandated programs. So they had to start taxing everything, your fire bill, your phone bill, your insurance, everything in the goddamn world was taxed after Reagan. So, in fact, he also deregulated the trucking industry, so Mexico could send trucks up here with no brakes and all kinds of crap, and he started having these runaway trucks. And let's go back a minute, even before that, to Prohibition. But before I do that, let's finish the moon race. To get to the moon, we had to have the Saturn V. That was the most powerful liquid fuel rocket on Earth. He had a little 10-foot solid foot rocket on top of the Apollo module in case the rocket blew up. There were dynamite bolts holding that thing on, but that little rocket could take it 50 miles away, and it was at a little bit of an angle. If you ever look at the thing, it's just a slight angle. It could have blasted off and taken that the module out. The shuttle had no way out. It had two solid fuel boosters on the left and the right, and they were bolted down with dynamite bolts. The dynamite bolt catchers were not designed to catch the full force of the dynamite bolts that were 70 inches long and weighed 30. Let's see. No, they weighed 70 pounds, so half of one weighed 35 pounds. I can't remember how long they were, how long they were, but anyway, the O-rings for the solid fuel boosters were like 57 feet in diameter or something. They were like huge. And those things were never designed to seal those rockets. They actually would not seal below 57 degrees Fahrenheit. And on the first one that blew up, the Challenger in 85, I was in Florida. There was ice on that launch pad. It was 20 degrees Fahrenheit in the morning. It was a January. Reagan was going to give the State of the Union address that night. There was no need to launch that day. In fact, the Morton Thiokol rocket scientists who made the solid fuel said don't launch, and then they were told to change their minds because they were going to put the teacher in space, Macaulay, and Reagan wanted to talk to Macaulay on the phone that night on the TV. And so she died 90 seconds after that thing took off when the O-rings leaked. And what they leaked to heat up was the liquid fuel oxygen tank and the hydrogen tank that were in that big piece of crap in the middle that's not streamlined. By the way, that liquid fuel tank is $100 million per shuttle, was jettisoned in the Indian Ocean every time that thing flew. It was supposed to be a glider so it could glide back to Earth, or at least von Braun was going to make the shuttle into a glider, so it was going to be totally reusable. Instead, they put three 25,000 horsepower engines on it so they could go to Brandenburg Air Force Base in California. To get funding for it, that had to be a military plane like thing. So they made it, they got it through the military budget. And by the way, contrary to the way things are now with the Russians, John Kennedy wanted to ally with the Russians to go to the moon because it was so expensive. And he didn't see us. Why should we have to duplicate efforts? So and right now we couldn't rebuild a Saturn V if we wanted to. You needed the Saturn V as a glider, and I have a picture of one I could show you on the next thing I'll show it, or I could just stop now and come back, which I better do. Get a couple of paper towels. Okay, this is kind of part two of Dan Russo running for president. Let's start with what Donald Trump doesn't know and the stupid NASA doesn't know. The guy he put in charge of NASA is some kind of military fuck who wasn't even alive when we went to the moon. I was born in 52, went to the moon in 69. Kennedy was dead, and jackass Nixon was president, who ordered a break-in of the Watergate Hotel and ordered the burglary of Daniel Ellsberg offices to try to prove he was crazy or something. It was part of who wrote the Pentagon Papers or released the Pentagon Papers. This was the Saturn V that we should have had as a glider. If you see this big rocket this is a NASA photograph. This is a Saturn V with the space shuttle piggybacked on the back. Nixon put 3 Saturn Vs in a museum, or I think one of them's in Huntsville, 2 of them are in Florida. And we had machinists at the time who could help build this thing. Right now, we don't have the machinists. We're just now training machinists. We didn't train any new machinists for 58 years. This Saturn V was a 3-stage liquid-fueled rocket. The shuttle was a glider. There was no 25,000 horsepower motors on it. It was going to glide back to Earth. The Saturn V was going to glide back to Earth. It was totally reusable. There was no solid fuel boosters on it. You had the first stage, the second stage, and the third stage of the Saturn V. It would get to the orbit, to the edge of the atmosphere, in which case then the shuttle would be put in orbit. So to go to the moon, all you had to do was get in orbit. Once you got in orbit, you could turn the third stage rockets off and you could go around the Earth. And meanwhile, you have to use Newton's laws and Kepler's laws to calculate where the moon is going to be when you get there. You cannot just shoot a rocket off the Earth at the moon. You have to go in orbit, and then you do what's called you have to actually wait for the time when the moon will be. The moon's at a certain spot when you're in orbit, and it's still continuing to orbit around the Earth while you are in orbit. It's 280,000 miles to the moon. It takes 2 days to get to the moon. So, I mean, we can only go 25,000 miles an hour. So maybe you can get 250,000 miles in 10 hours. Okay. You got to go 280,000 miles. Okay. And you have to be at that spot where it is so you get captured by its gravitational pull. So you go into its orbit. Once you orbit the moon, then you now have the lunar module, which you're going to have to land on the moon. You cannot take that whole capsule with the 3 men down into the moon. There's no way you're going to get back up off the moon with that capsule. So they had built this lunar module that had little rockets on it, and you were going to release it from the Apollo, and it was going to turn on its little retro rockets. That would slow it down. Once it slowed down, the moon would pull it into the moon. So, and they had it figured out where it was going to land. And I think they were off somewhat, but they had enough power in the module, enough fuel to move through the lunar landscape to land where they wanted to in the sea of tranquility, they called it. Okay, so originally there was a big problem trying to figure out how to get to the moon because they were going to, I mean, it took a lot of fuel to get a Saturn V off the ground. I can't remember how much fuel. It was like boxcar full, like train, railroad train boxcars full of fuel. That first stage was burning. And it was, I don't know, 1,000,000 pounds of thrust. It was a huge, huge amount of thrust. And, you know, they use solid fuel because it's cheaper. But like I said, you can't turn it on and off, and you can't steer it. And von Braun found that out when he lit the Chinese rockets on his little wagon he had tied to the wagon that went down the street and ran into a bunch of people. He could not steer that wagon once he lit the rockets. And he learned that lesson very well because he got put in jail when he was 12 in Germany for that. And even I wouldn't want to be put in jail in Germany. I mean, and we're talking about Tempelhof Air Dome, that's in Berlin. So, by the way, later Hitler, instead of killing himself, he went to Tempelhof Air Dome, took a plane to Spain, took a car across or a plane across to Portugal, got on a submarine with the other 49 other top Nazi officers, and they went by U-boat to Argentina, where he later went to Chile. So Hitler was running this whole bunch of Nazis that were left behind as they retreated from Sicily. They left behind Nazis in Sicily, and then in Italy, and then Galen said the Soviets had 175 battle-ready divisions ready to reinvade Poland in 46, Germany in 47. When the Nazis started a riot in Czechoslovakia in 48, Stalin sent in tanks. They said Stalin was going to reinvade Europe. Had 175 battle-ready divisions. This was all General Galen's bullshit, who had traded his barrels of microfilm he had buried in pastures in Austria for his job in the CIA with Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was a crooked lawyer. His brother was a crooked lawyer. Together they laundered Hitler's stolen billions. And that's where along with the Bush family and the Thyssen private banks, there was 3 private banks in Berlin, Rotterdam, and New York. And Bush, George Prescott Bush and George Herbert Walker, George Bush Sr.'s grandfathers, ran this bank in New York. So there they helped launder Hitler's stolen billions with the Thyssen family banks. And Fritz Thyssen, the Allies interrogated him for 4 years, wanting to know what foreign banks the money was in that Hitler had stolen. He'd stolen all the gold, including from the Rothschilds. This Nazi propaganda out there now that the Rothschilds helps finance the war or something, this bullshit. The Nazis burned a Rothschild woman alive at Auschwitz because she refused to sit with a Nazi officer at a dinner party. And so they just put her in Auschwitz in a crematorium and burned her alive. And I mean, you don't do that to people that helped you finance your war. By the way, the corrupt Steel Empire financed Hitler in World War II, financed Kaiser Wilhelm in World War I, financed Bismarck in the 1840s. 1848 was the turning point that didn't turn because Bismarck stopped all the revolutions in Europe. And the only one he didn't stop was the French Revolution. And the French, by the way, were imperialists. And, you know, Napoleon lost 2/3 of his army invading Russia. They froze to death or were killed. I think he lost 80,000 in one day at Borodino, the battle in Russia. And retreat, you know, the Russians had burnt Moscow and moved to the Ural Mountains 1,000 miles away. And that's exactly what Stalin did before Hitler invaded, by the way. He first invaded Poland in 1939. He didn't invade Russia or the Soviet Union until 1941. So people don't realize Stalin took half of Poland for a buffer zone And this treaty with Hitler was just to buy time because he knew. But here's what's so strange about Stalin. He was born in Georgia. He wasn't really Russian. He spoke Georgian. If you know anybody from Georgia and anyone from Russia, you know Russians can't understand Georgian. Georgians can't understand Russian. Um, Trotsky was Lenin's right-hand man, and he ran the civil war against the Tsar's army after the revolution from a train that went all over Soviet Union, now what was called the Soviet Union, in this huge civil war. And millions of people starved to death during the civil war. And Stalin let millions of Ukrainians starve to death in the war. But uh, Lenin really couldn't stop the starvation, and that was the problem. He had promised three things: land, bread, and peace. Okay, he broke up the land, and he had peace by stopping the war. Trotsky negotiated the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, I guess was the thing where the Nazis or the Germans thought they could, with all their technology and the steel empire, they could dictate, but Trotsky didn't let them have everything they wanted. So they were turning purple. but it was a mutiny of the army against the war. It was a capitalist war, according to the way Marx thought. Who made the money off the war? The Krupp Steel Empire made money. They sold to both sides during the Russo-Japanese War between Russia and Japan in I think around 1905 or 6. And by the way, Kirk Douglas's father fought in that war, and he was Jewish. And by the way, Kirk Douglas has a book, The Ragman's Son. Talks about having 5 sisters, and his mother said they were dreck because they were poor. His father sold rags, but um, and he had a horse and buggy, but ignored his family. So his wife took the kids and moved out and got another house later. But Kirk Douglas hitchhiked his way uh, to theater school or some school somewhere where he learned how to act. He wanted to be an actor. He saw a movie and wanted to be a movie actor. And by the way, Bruce Willis also decided when he was young he was going to be a movie actor. And Kirk, by the way, has a new book out about directing Spartacus, which Stanley Kubrick was the cameraman for that movie, and Kirk about ran him to death, ragged. And Kubrick was a genius in photography. Somebody gave him a camera when he was 10 or 12 or something, and did some great work. The 2001 Space Odyssey, and that was funny. Okay. And he did that one he lit with candlelight, where he used these cameras he bought from Hollywood. So I can't remember what they used them for, but he needed the lenses, and then he was able to film a home movie by candlelight. And I saw that movie years ago and didn't know anything about this until I took some courses at the University of Art, Academy of Art at University in California. Anyway, so let's get back to the moonshot, and then we'll go back to where the war. Okay, to go to the moon, you need a space station, and you need a moon base, and you need a shuttle to supply the moon base. So you need a shuttle to build the space station and to supply the moon base. And now we don't have a shuttle. We don't have a moon base. We don't have a space station. We've got the Russian space station, thank God. But I heard NASA doesn't even know why it needs a space station or a space shuttle. And then I was looking at their stupid moon rocket. It looks like you took the Empire State Building and built a rocket fuselage around it. It's a huge, huge monstrosity. And I'm hearing that they're talking about using solid fuel somewhere on that rocket. And that means that you're going to have a disaster of what almost what Ghostbusters would call of epic proportions. Okay, I'm talking, real wrath of God type stuff. I mean, uh, let's look at this little stupid disaster you had with the Columbia. Uh, the bolt catchers for the dynamite bolts that held the Columbia's solid fuel boosters to the ground. In fact, one time when one of those shuttles was taken off, one of the bolts didn't dynamite and kept holding the thing down until it ripped the bolt out of the ground. I'm talking about us. I don't remember how long that thing is, but it's 70-pound bolt. It's so many feet long, um, and they're dynamite bolts. So uh, the solid fuel boosters on the old shuttle only burnt for 2 minutes, but for the first 2 minutes, you could not get out of that shuttle, and you could only get out at 35,000 feet by sliding down a tube around the wing to bail out with a parachute. And I don't know about you, but no one's ever actually done it, and it's not. If the thing blew up on the ground, there's no way out. And if I was just watching this horrible history the other day in '68, the year Nixon got elected, or elected. I guess we call it elected. He couldn't have got elected if Kennedy had been alive. If if John were dead, if Bobby hadn't got shot dead before he went to California after he won the New York primary. And by the way, there was no Secret Service protection of Bobby or any candidate at that time, and now there is. But back then there wasn't. I remember Trump had to ask for his protection, uh, and he was paying. I don't know. I mean, it was costing so much, millions a week, 7 million a week or something for protecting the Trump Tower. Um, anyway, and um, but Bobby got killed within a few months of Martin Luther King. We'd lost Kennedy in '63 because the CIA wanted him dead because they wanted to escalate the war in Vietnam, and he wanted to dismantle the CIA. So it was very simple. LBJ was told he was going to be shot. He didn't care because Bobby had called him a stupid hick from Texas or something, and he said it. Told his mistress, and it's on YouTube. You can find it in a couple of places. She's on there twice. She's dead now too, by the way. She said that LBJ told her the night before that John was going to be shot, and he said, "I don't care if they kill both those sons of bitches after tomorrow, and I don't have to worry about them." So he kept his mouth shut. He was afraid they were going to shoot him. They said they weren't, and they got him to build up Da Nang Air Force Base, which he started doing as soon as he could take power. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King was marching and got put in jail in Birmingham, Alabama in '63. Kennedy wrote a civil rights bill he didn't think the Democrats in the South would vote for because the KKK down there ran everything, and George Wallace later ran for president from down there. Anti-segregate, anti-integration guy didn't want to integrate the schools, but Kennedy sent National Guard or something down there when Wallace stood at the schoolhouse door with a axe handle or something, and they were using fire or water cannons on children in Birmingham and Bull Connors was using German shepherds to attack the demonstrators, and King couldn't get the adults to march, so he used children. And there's children being water hosed with water cannon up against buildings and stuff. It was horrible, and tear gas was used. By the way, in the Democratic Convention in '68 in Chicago, the police used tear gases and fire hoses. And I remember thinking at the time, the way the police were beaten, there was all this talk about police brutality. This is a long time before you had this stuff now about black people getting shot by police, although black people have been lynched and shot in this country ever since before the Civil War. They slave owners used to whip blacks, used to whip the wives of the slaves, the males, in the street. Besides raping these women and selling them down the river selling the women and children down the river to New Orleans stock auction block. And as Jefferson said, the slaves would never be happy here, but someday they'd have the vote. So now the blacks have the vote, but they're not happy, and I don't blame them. I think we've got a racist judicial system. It's a horrible system. And by the way, when you look at Hoover and the Birth of the Nation, the movie that he showed in the White House for 3 or 4 days was a very racist movie written by a Klansman. The book was written by a Klansman, and it was about a black Civil War Union soldier raping a woman and her daughter, I guess. In the movie, just her daughter commit suicide. In the book, her mother and her daughter commit suicide, jump off a cliff. So, and that, by the way, Gone with the Wind in 1939 was also from the point of view of the South. And funny thing about Metro-Goldwyn, Mayor Goldwyn was Jewish from Poland. He walked across Poland to England, got a ride, either borrowed the money or somehow he got on a ship over here. He only worked 1 year with with Myers, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. He started his own film company, and he did, what was the movie? It's a whole different movie than Gone with the Wind. The year MGM won, the year Myers won the Academy Award with Gone with the Wind, he had another movie. It was one written by it was a British story. Jesus. It's not Wuthering Heights. Anyways, it's about this man that's in love with a woman that later dies when he marries her, or something like that. Can't remember the story. But Hitler knew when he killed the Jews that the Jewish movie makers were successful, and he couldn't. Him and I guess it was Goebbels was his propaganda minister. They knew that they couldn't do what they couldn't do what we could do with our diversity, but he killed 29 million Soviets. He had a division whose job was to go to the city and take all the men and shoot them in the market square and put the women and children in churches and set them on fire and shoot anyone who tried to get out. So he did that across the Ukraine. Das Reich, this division, and there's a documentary of it on TV, on the History Channel. And almost every day you see something different about the Nazis' atrocities. And I grew up with nuns who escaped from Nazi Germany. I had women from the Society of the Poor Child Jesus who had a gold band on their finger. They were married to Jesus. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And they lived on $15 a month for their personal items. And I learned discipline. But the problem was they wanted all the boys to be priests. Well, all my grandparents had 8 children. I liked girls in first grade. I liked women. I did not want to be a priest, go to a seminary for 13 years with all boys, never get married. I didn't think it was natural. I didn't know anything about virginity or homosexuality or anything. But when my mother told me when I was 6, I had an older sister, Brenda, who's gone now, but that time, me and my sister, she said my mother didn't believe in the virgin birth. And so when the nuns told me there was that God was Father of Jesus. First of all, I thought it was strange because I'd had to memorize the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not uh, covet thy neighbor's wife or thy neighbor's goods. Yeah, that was Moses' law, and we had to go see the movie, The Ten Commandments, when I was in fifth grade, and they paid for it, 50 cents back then. They took us all to watch the movie. And it was exactly the way the book said it was, including the pillar of fire and everything, the burning bush, all that. So I watched this movie, and then they told me that, they told us, I guess, in second grade or something, or third grade, that Mary was a virgin and that God was the father, while Joseph, what was Joseph? He was the cuckold. I mean, it didn't make any sense. Then now I'm hearing people tell me that she wasn't married at the time. I mean, we never heard that. We were heard, she was married to Joseph and she got pregnant by God. So it seemed to me that was adultery, and I couldn't see why. I mean, in the Greek mythology, you had Zeus running around all the time with mortals. Hercules was a demigod. Zeus was his father. Hera was jealous. She was always trying to kill Zeus in the TV show, which at that time when I was little, I guess I read about the Iliad and the Odyssey. I didn't get the idea that Hera was trying to kill Hercules, but Hercules was half god, and I think I you know if God was the Father, then Jesus was half God. But it turns out that some king, some Christian king, Constantine in Constantinople, Turkey, put people to death if they didn't believe in the Holy Trinity, that the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost are three in one, all divine, all eternal. In the ancient Egyptian astrology, mythology, you have Isis and Osiris were both gods, and their son was Horus, who was a god. So Horus is called the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. I mean, fights the devil Saint Set at the end of time. This big battle. It's very much like the apocalypse Revelations. So, in that mythology, Osiris's brother is jealous and kills him and cuts him up and puts him in the Nile. And River eats crocodile eats his penis. And she takes a reed, makes a new penis, but in one version she's pregnant before he gets killed. So suppose Mary was pregnant before she married Joseph. That would explain a lot. Then you don't have to have God impregnating her. She was just pregnant before. And Jesus really wasn't that original, I hear. He followed Isaiah, who was a prophet, who said, resist not evil. And if you read Edith Hamilton's book, The Prophets of Israel, you find out about the different prophets of Israel before, the whole history of the prophets in the Old Testament, all of those books, Amos and all those guys, book of, okay. And my name is Daniel Anthony Russo, and Mother said she named me Daniel after Daniel Boone. And then later, she said she named me Daniel after Daniel in the Bible. Well, I guess Daniel Boone was named after Daniel in the Bible. The only good thing about that, I could have been named Stephen. She was going to name me Steve. My grandmother from Italy wanted to name me Armando. Uh, her daughter Jerry wanted to name me Ramon. My mother wanted an American name. She didn't want to name me an Italian name. And so I ended up Daniel Anthony Russo because my dad's Antonio or Tony Russo. My dad fought Japanese in World War II. When I was 8 years old, he handed me a black Japanese Zero model plane I put together, which I thought was strange at the time because I had nuns from Germany, and here he's handing me a Japanese Zero. Turns out Howard Hughes designed that plane. The American government didn't want to buy it, so he sold it to the Japanese, which was used for the kamikaze planes that tore up our ships back then. And I think Edsel Ford had a hangar full of planes ready to go, either bombers or some kind of planes ready to go the day the war started, World War II. Anna East Nen says America was gung ho on war at that time. Um, and that was true. Everybody fought in that war. We didn't really need Korea, and Eisenhower shut it down in '53. It was an undeclared war. It was also a racist war. We're killing yellow skinned people over there. And North Korea invaded South Korea. Now, the British had given the Russians the Rolls Royce jet engine, which they used for the MiG. So, um, and we were fighting MiGs in North Korea. Okay. So Russia was helping North Korea. But Vietnam, I met a Russian translator who was supposed to be intercepting Russian messages. And the whole time we were in Vietnam, he never intercepted one Russian messages because there wasn't any. And by the way, Vietnam had been a colony of China for 1,000 years. So it taken them 1,000 years to get out from under Chinese colonialism. And then Ho Chi Minh was fighting the French colonialists in the 30s. And as Jack Warner said, if you were fighting Nazis in the 30s and 40s, they accused you of being a communist in the 50s. And a lot of people had joined the Communist Party to fight Nazis. And even in the Spanish Civil War in the 20s, there was an American brigade went over there to fight the fascists in Spain. And then Hitler used the Luftwaffe, helped Franco in Spain bomb civilians or strafe and bomb civilians. They used to strafe apartment buildings and get all the people out in the street. And then when the government was sending tanks in, there was a communist government of Spain. They were Franco overthrew. Um, the streets were jammed with people. They couldn't get the tanks in to fight the fascists anyway. Collingwood, Robin George Collingwood, a British philosopher, has an autobiography where he talks about um, the revolution in Spain, the education system and stuff. And if you read Hemingway's book, For Whom the Bell Tolls, where they kill all these fascists, they march them off the cliffs and stuff. Um, that was, he said he would, the guy, I don't know if it's a Spanish guy or somebody, says if he could, he would put all of those people back, put it back the way it was. You know, Bernie Sanders keeps talking about a revolution uh, like it's a tea party. And revolution is overthrow the ruling class by violence. It's almost impossible to not use violence in a revolution because you have the ruling class uses the rules as they see fit. So the Ten Commandments that goes out the window. Uh, they tell you in times of peace, thou shalt not kill, but in times of war, they tell you to kill as many the enemy as possible. And anyone who was in the U.S. Army knows that it's, you know, they ask them, what's my job? And they laugh because they train you to kill. Um, and that's basically, you know, I mean, when you look at Alvin York and Sergeant York, the movie, he was against killing. The Bible, the commandment, the Old Testament, the law of Moses, the old original Jewish law was thou shalt not kill. Nietzsche says that one sentence has killed more people than any other sentence in human history. And you think about that, how does that work? Somebody kills somebody, maybe it's a crime of passion that maybe just happened maybe it was an accident. And then you've got people that want to kill him. I'm not sure if it's Ron Paul or somebody said that if you can legally kill people, if the state can legally kill people, then other people get the idea it's okay to kill people. And Trump, claims he's Christian. He has this idea that, um, it's okay to bomb people in certain cases, blah, 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 blah. And right now he's got troops over in Afghanistan. And the people there have had 10 years of Russia and 14 years of us or something. I think 24, 25 years of war. They were sick of war a long time ago. We really haven't declared a war since 1941. And I would make a law that says you cannot send an American into a place where he can get killed, whether you want to call it a war or police action or hostility, or don't want to call it anything, don't want to admit you're even fighting, like they don't want to admit in Congress, who've abdicated their power of the purse for the war. They're letting presidents send troops into to start a war for 90 days, and then they say you got to support the troops. But Eisenhower shut down the Korean War, and King called the Vietnam War a racist war. We were killing yellow-skinned people, and the boys, the blacks and the poor whites who were dying together on the battlefields in Vietnam. Because if you're rich, your father could bribe a doctor to say you're 4F to get out of it, $50,000. Only the poor went over there, and a lot of West Virginians. 600 men from West Virginia died. That's a lot of families that you could have had. Any case, the poor blacks and whites who died together in the same battlefields in Vietnam couldn't live together in the same neighborhoods in Detroit. And I was watching this documentary on Detroit the other day. I didn't realize how many blacks had gone to Detroit to get jobs. And now you look at Detroit, went bankrupt a couple of years ago, the auto dealers. Turns out the auto dealers did us a big disfavor. And I used to wonder when I'd see these trolley car tracks, why they didn't still have trolley cars. It turns out that, and they talk about Americans don't want mass transportation, blah, 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 blah. We used to have mass transportation. We used to have cities with trolley cars. And the auto manufacturers bought up the land that had the trolley cars on them. And then they put the trolley cars out of business. So people would have to buy cars. So now I was thinking about this the other day, because years ago I read this book on global warming. You don't really have a glass ceiling that's holding the heat in. It can go out at night, etc. Then you got Al Gore's movie, Inconvenient Truth, where he's showing this chart where it goes up and up and up and up and up every year. And this July was the hottest July we've had in the history of record keeping for heat since 1888. The problem in the book on global warming by a scientist I read years ago was, how do you figure out what the average temperature should be? So do you take a 10-year average or 100-year average or 1,000-year average? So from what I heard, we were going into an ice age every so many thousands of years. And in the 70s, they were talking about going into an ice age. And then, in fact, the nuclear winter with a nuclear war was going to black out the sky, and we would freeze to death. So, but then the atmosphere started heating up, and then Johnny Carson was on TV one night, had this joke about, or not a joke or something, about how many gallons of gasoline we burn a year. It was something like 6 some odd trillion number. And he said, someone would say, if you put all of that into one smokestack, imagine burning 6 trillion. He was talking about why there was a gasoline shortage. Well, the Arabs got together and blockaded the oil tankers to stop in the 73, I think, that created the shortages. But they've, by the way, since then lost control of the oil. But we use a hell of a lot of gasoline. So, and with this debt we have now, this 552 trillion, I think one more disaster like a super volcano or a megaquake. You've got the Long Valley caldera in Southern California is going to be is a super volcano bigger than Yellowstone. If Yellowstone erupts, it takes out 5 states, and the dust cloud goes all the way to LA. You would feel it all the way here. Cascadia Fault will be a 9.2 earthquake up in the Northwest Pacific. It'll kill 13,000 people, displace millions. The Hayward Fault in California and San Francisco, it's a 7.0. They're not ready for. Only kill 800 people, but they're not ready for it. Then you've got this volcano in Hawaii that's 4,000 feet tall that slips in the ocean every once in a while in the south of the Big Island, the Helena Slump. That will cause a 1,000-foot tsunami that'll go all the way to Japan. 200 feet of that will hit the west coast. Mount Rainier is ready to go. That'll take out 50 miles around Seattle. 100-foot tsunami from the Cascadia Fault earthquake, the 9.2. So they're saying get off the west coast. You will not survive a 200-foot tsunami on the west coast from Hawaii. Well, and then a 100-foot after tsunami. So that's just too much. So we are in trouble, almost bankrupt, and one of those would bankrupt us. And let's say it this way: if you wipe out the whole western half of the United States, Trump's going to be running around looking like an idiot. But meanwhile, NATO wants to go to war with Russia, and Israel wants to go to war with Iran's ally with Russia. So we're talking about a nuclear World War III. Putin calls Cold War World War III. He says it'll be World War IV. The next World War will be fought with sticks and stones. And by the way, after Reagan bombed Benghazi in '86, after the Israelis put the transmitter in Benghazi that said they blew up the jet at Lockerbie, which they didn't do. And then Hillary had Gaddafi killed because she thought he had something to do with killing Americans on the jet in Lockerbie. That was a mistake. According to Gaddafi, Europe will turn black, and Libya was the only thing stopping the blacks from going across the Mediterranean into Europe. And Europe is 540 million rich people that we're protecting from 140 million poor Russians. With Obama put anti-ballistic missiles in Poland, and now we have 5,000 troops. Those missiles can be converted to nuclear warheads almost overnight, and Putin knows this, so he has Moscow's air defenses on high alert. And the EU wants to go to war with Russia and NATO. So Russia can destroy NATO in 60 hours. And we're spending almost $1 trillion a year. Its budget is $1 trillion a year. We pay 86% of that. So you got 300 and some million Americans spending almost $1 trillion a year to protect 540 million rich Europeans from 140 million poor Russians. And those Russians helped destroy some of Hitler's best divisions, the Red Army, and the biggest tank battle in the world at Kursk for a week, destroyed Panzer divisions and everything else. So the Russians have tanks that will go in 40 below weather. They've got one that works on the North Pole now. They've got their fighter jets. You cannot disable them with a cigarette butt. You can disable ours if it sucks up a cigarette butt. All this stuff Trump has got, this so-called weaponry he's got, is hyped up. It's out. It's not. We're not getting our money's worth. And the Chinese were knocking off counterfeit parts for the military. I think 70% or something of our parts were made by Chinese. I mean, you've got 40 international corporations around the world that don't give a damn about us in the United States. They don't care about the Russians or the Chinese. They just put their factories in the most suitable geographic location where they make the most profit. So anyway, when the bond rate for the government bond in Japan, the Japanese printed up 12 trillion yen to buy back their debt. Inflation is forcing the bond rate to zero. It was 0.02% a couple of weeks ago. When that goes to zero, and it will with inflation, their bonds will be worthless, their money will be worthless, and their economy will collapse when all their paper is worthless. When their economy collapses, our economy will collapse, and Fed is now going to take down the bond rate from wherever it is down to zero because they did it to try to get rid of Trump, but it didn't work. And now we owe so much money that talking about runaway inflation, if that happens, then it'll be worthless anyway. So when the bond rate goes to zero, it'll be worth nothing. So and we sold, I don't know, almost $1 trillion worth of treasuries to the Chinese and the Japanese, which the Chinese have been mining gold and minting gold coins for years. And now, and they had a 14% growth rate when Trump didn't believe they had a 7% growth rate. And they killed 40 million managers when they had the revolution. See my page on the lowdown on China. The bottoms, whenever you have tops and bottoms of society, you have an unethical society. So, and this country is set up with extremes in wealth and poverty. So it's an unethical country. Capitalism is based on taking advantage of, capitalizing on the misfortunes of the poor. So, and the poor you will always have with you, but right now, America is a paradise for drugs, gambling, and prostitution, and the pharma mafias. That one, I guess Purdue or whatever that made OxyContin, they shipped 76 billion tabs to the pharmacies, and all those people overdosed. 72, I don't know, out of 72,000 people last year that overdosed on heroin, 80% started on prescription drugs. If you take heroin and morphine, you add a carbon chain, you get OxyContin, oxycodone. So they knew it was addictive when they made it, and then they told the doctors it wasn't, and then they shipped it, and people overdosed on it, and people got addicted to it, and then people got addicted to heroin. So, and 92% of the heroin's coming from Afghanistan, and it was coming from Thailand, but now it's Afghanistan. And who basically got us in Afghanistan? So, and now Trump is trying to get out, and it's costing him $50 billion a year. I heard today Pompeo say $30 billion. It's $50 billion, and we walked in, we can walk out, according to Ron Paul. So we could declare victory and walk out tomorrow or today. Should have been out 2 years ago. Should never have gone in Afghanistan. We're losing 300 men a month in Afghanistan. Bin Laden is dead. 92% of the heroin's coming from there. What the hell are we doing in Afghanistan? So just spending money. And basically, Vietnam War, we lost 58,000. Korea, we lost 38,000. We didn't need to lose any more men we didn't really need to go into World War II. Churchill talked Roosevelt into going into that war. And ever since that war, we've been at war pretty much. Ever since I've been born. I was born in 52. We were in Korea in 50, left in 53. Then Kennedy was shot when I was 11 at 63. We were already in Vietnam from World War II. We had Green Beret and CIA there in the 50s. When Kennedy wanted to pull out, they killed him. And now we have an all-volunteer army, which is a ridiculous thing. If you don't want a big government, then the standing army is a branch of the standing government. So you can't, if you want to as Thoreau says, the government that governs least governs best. So he thought the government that governed not at all would even be better. The Chinese say governing their countries like cooking a small fish. Either you have to be very, very careful, or why cook it at all. So, um, I mean, you see people naked and afraid cooking these little tiny things. I mean, give me a break, as I would say. I mean, by the way, I hate that show. And I hate the show where they poured scorpions all over people and stuff. I really don't. And I don't really believe, I mean, if the French, the Saw movies, they said were too sadistic, they banned them for the populations over there, and over here they're on TV. Then they got the zombie movies and all this crap. You really don't need this stuff because the country is becoming, they say art mirrors society. And Oscar Wilde says society mirrors art. So in this case, you've got all this crap going on. And then no one has read Freud's Civilization and his malaise. The problem, why is there violence in advanced industrial society? Uh, Repression of emotions and sexual emotions on assembly line jobs and repetitive jobs, postal jobs and things like that, or um, basically cause emotions to build up in people like steam builds up in a pressure cooker and they explode. So then they're looking for the motive for the explosion, blah, 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 blah. As Nietzsche says, there is no motive for everything. And by the way, a lot of things in nature are spontaneous. But when you're talking about an explosion, there's a cause for the explosion. It was the pressure got to be too much. And some people, by the way, snap. Uh, and that's what happened. And the guy and they reach a point where they want to commit suicide. So not only that, but there's a thing in philosophy where all that exists is an activity in the present moment. So you need to be active all the time. And I got to say, I tried until I got my foot broken. I guess 81. I guess I quit jogging. I quit hitchhiking. I slowed down. I started gaining weight. But at 16, I was 145 pounds. I was in the band. I marched 3 hours a day in August for football practice for the halftime shows, and I had to do push-ups if I did something wrong. My band director was ex-Green Beret and fought in Korea when he was 17, and I was in shape. And I ended up marching till 84, so 14 years. And I used to carry a backpack full of books to school, and I'm still pretty strong, uh, but this last, I had an operation in February, and the insurance didn't want to pay for wound care, and I ended up with edema in both legs, and now my legs are weak as babies, and makes me sleepy, and it's not good for me. So I need a swimming pool, and the stupid landlord took out the pool here. I'm in Fort Lee, New Jersey. It doesn't have one city pool. It's what I call a one-horse town. The mayor's a chain-smoking real estate agent who's really too busy to be mayor. So too busy to do his job. But he's 10 years younger than me, and I think if he'd either run for mayor and put him out of office and change a few things. One thing, they don't want to pay the insurance for a swimming pool. So they talk about West Virginia. There's one town, Huntington, West Virginia, has 6 city pools. Marshall University has a football team, has a medical school, a VA school, and a VA hospital, uh, and 6 city pools. New York has, I think, 93 pools. I don't know how many pools are in New Jersey. All the apartments here have one. This one used to have one. Landlord here is named Lowenstein, and I have never seen the guy. I've been here since 2006 after a bunch of floods for 10 years in West Virginia. And then I didn't think this place was hilly like West Virginia, but it turns out it's made out of this ugly gray stone, and some of the hills here are a mile down, a mile up. a 45-degree angle, it looks like. So it's like ridiculous. It's ridiculous. In fact, I think the Dan Aykroyd movie about New Jersey is accurate. They've been using jackhammers and digging up the street. It really reminds me of like, um, imagine 200 years ago when the British were here with little coaches running around with horses, and then they just paved over the horse paths through, and the roads are like so narrow, it's ridiculous. Okay. And then you got cars parked on both sides and the jitneys running down the middle. So, and then people backing out of their driveways into the road, which is illegal. In most states, it's illegal to back into the highway or back into the road. So I don't know. The way these houses are designed with the garage under the bedroom it's a bad design. Um, just a lot of stupid stuff going on here. I mean, they call it the Garden State, but probably one of the most corrupt states in the Union, along with New York. And, well, it's hard to say now. But America's a paradise for drugs, gambling, and prostitution. And the other day when I was on Facebook, I said, in general, Americans are as full of shit as pet monkeys. And they banned me for 3 days. Facebook. I don't know what they think they're going to do, but I think they'll declare martial law when the economy shuts down. I think the banks will close. You won't be able to buy oil or gasoline. You won't be able to get your money out of the bank. All paper money will be worthless. All debt will be wiped out, but you won't be able to buy food or gasoline. And that's when the preppers who have stored up all this food and water and stuff, and guns and ammo and whiskey to trade and stuff, and silver and gold, that's when they think they're going to prosper. But I heard the rich people have these cities built undergrounds where they're just going to lock themselves in for 100 years or something. But martial law will be declared, and California is already extremely short of water, and they're prone to earthquakes, and LA and Frisco are two of the most dangerous cities in the world out of the top 10. So I'm expecting earthquakes and volcanoes out there to be, it's hard to tell, but I expect a mass migration, I guess, out of there if all hell breaks loose. But if you look at just what happened in the Bahamas and imagine the whole West Coast after a 200-foot tsunami, it's pretty much will look about the same way. And so 35 million people in California, I don't know how many in Oregon and Washington, and then Yellowstone is 250 cubic miles of lava under that thing. It's had 3,000 earthquakes last year, and I've had ground splitting open in Montana, and they've had earthquakes that the USGS isn't even reporting. That will take out 5 immediate states surrounding Yellowstone, and the bison already run away. The ground's heating up. There's a new hotspot discovered from a satellite there. Every day they're watching that thing. Something new's happening. And if you have an earthquake in Russia or something, a mega quake, it goes through the center of the earth and comes up. It affects the magma under Yellowstone. So the whole thing, there's an old Buddhist saying, everything is connected to everything else. And Martin Luther King used to say, if there's injustice anywhere, there's injustice everywhere. In this country, just looking at these 2 women that reported Harvey Weinstein today, he'd been buying off silence for 40 years, and finally it got out. So that's just the tip of the iceberg, because there's so many people here with huge psychological problems, and psychology is a science of feeling, not a science of thinking. It's not ethics. It's not. It isn't based on your thinking so much, except for one thing. Your whole body is one biological organism made up of parts, but they supposed to work together. Your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, your digestive system, your immune system, and all this stuff. Um, so um, we don't eat right, we don't exercise enough, we don't live right, we pollute. Pollution is the external portrait, so we've got the whole earth polluted, and we're suffering. So, and then you've got the social problems, political problems, economic problems. It takes, and Trump isn't anywhere near, doesn't have anywhere near the education he thinks he's well educated. He reminds me of something I think it was Dostoevsky says about half educated uh, people in some town. I don't know if it's St. Petersburg or what. St. There's a difference between a carpenter who's like a craftsman and an artist. Half educated craftsman is basically what you got, what you want. And even his theory, I mean, Trump's theory of justice is 2,000 years old, out of date. It goes back to Plato's Thrasymachus, who thought justice was helping your friends and hurting your enemies. The problem was you don't know who your real enemies are, who your real friends are. So that's why Socrates couldn't say if the king of Minos was happy, because he didn't know. If he knew who his real enemies were, he couldn't punish his enemies if he didn't know who they were. And as Trump himself knows, if you're rich, people kiss your rear end. He doesn't like yes men, but he's surrounded by yes men and Israeli spies. I figure Kushner must be working for the Israelis. Basically, but the Israelis don't give a damn about the Jews. The problem is the Jews think they do. So, um, especially American Jewry, but except for a few guys like Finkelstein, and you can look on YouTube. 98% of Israel is atheist. I'm hearing they spit on Christians, and then if they complain or something, they deport them. Um, and they really, they go back to Nietzsche's book on the Antichrist. He says Christianity is a Jewish sect. And, the Nazis tried to prove Jesus wasn't Jewish and that the Old Testament wasn't written by the Jews, but they couldn't do it. And the guy who tried, it turned out, had 3 Jewish grandparents. Later let himself freeze to death in the Alps somewhere to keep from going to a concentration camp after he spent years trying to prove that the Old Testament wasn't written by the Jews, etc. But only 2% of the Israelis' DNA goes back to the 12 tribes of Israel, which includes, you're talking about the God of Abraham and Levi. Only 2% go back to that. And then the temple was destroyed, second temple, and all the priests were killed that kept track of the genealogy. So even if they rebuilt the temple, they don't have the priests and they don't have the genealogy. So they really don't know who's who. And what I'm hearing was there's a documentary on this about a barbarian tribe that converted to Judaism in the 8th century for political expediency. But that means that if 98% of the Israelis are descended from that tribe, which was north of Israel, in a land that fought all of its neighbors all the time, if that's true, and 98% of them are atheists, and only 2% from the original 12 tribes, then that means 98% of the people we're allied with are not really Israelis. They're just imposters. The problem is that they stole this land the Palestinians lived on for 2,000 years, and they don't want to give it back. And when the UN condemned them, are building on the West Bank, etc., East Jerusalem, Obama didn't have it vetoed. Mossad put out a hit on Obama. And the way the U.S. anti-terrorists, etc., FBI, CIA is set up, CIA says it doesn't operate in the U.S., but it gives FBI black ops if it wants to kill a president like Kennedy or something. It gives them the op. So it runs the op. But that's what happened with Kennedy. And then without Kennedy and without Bobby, of course, Bobby was really gung-ho on killing communists, but he got shot because he said he was going to give Israel fighter jets, and Sirhan didn't want Israel to have fighter jets, so he killed him. So many people out there don't believe that what happened. They believe the government's behind all this crap. The government right now is not run by us. It's run by the Mossad because they have control of the Congress. They control the media, and they wage war by line. And as long as we're supporting Israel, as long as they have their spies here blackmailing us and bribing us to support Israel and coercing us, we'll support Israel. So as long as that happens, there'll be no peace in the Mideast, and because they don't want peace, and they leak whenever there's a secret talk. And I'm even wondering about this talk with the Taliban. But as I said when I started out, the Taliban is not Al-Qaeda. Some of the tribes support Al-Qaeda, some don't, but Al-Qaeda was the base for jihad, and that was bin Laden's. And he was in this extreme Islamic sect that was so extreme that he had to kill an imam to get a job in one town. Then they kicked him out, and he did the same thing in another town. There's only one little tiny book that goes with that sect. He doesn't represent the majority, and Mossad is not working in the best interests of the U.S., to put it mildly, and it's not working in the best interests of Israel. So there's an old saying, to thine own self be true, then you can't be false to anybody. Mossad is not true to itself. It's greedy, lazy, selfish, conceited, fascist, out of control, and it's operating and it kills people for a living, basically. You eventually will reap what you sow, and they have sowed the wind, and they've got us sowing the wind in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's come back to bite us in the ass. And meanwhile, the media is completely oblivious. And most of the Democrats, except for one woman, Marianne Williamson, is supporting NATO, which wants to go to war, World War III, World War IV, a nuclear war with Russia. That is stupid. Trump is building intermediate range nuclear missiles. They've got Russia building intermediate range nuclear missiles. So that is just stupid. And I was just thinking this morning, Norman Rockwell, the Rockwell International plant out west is so radioactive. It won't admit its name is Rockwell. It's a toxic super cleanup site, and I don't think we've ever cleaned it up. Meanwhile, now we're going back and building more nuclear weapons. Where are they going to build them? In this radioactive plant? And then Trump has cut the safety regulations. I just wonder, because we don't have one safe nuclear reactor. We shut down all of them after three islands, I guess, most of them. The French have a safe design for a nuclear reactor, and they get 80% of their electricity from nuclear power. We don't have one safe design, so we don't have a standardized safety manual because we build every one different for every different geographical location. So, and then meanwhile, we've got all this radioactive waste, and they don't want to put it in the mountain out west because of environmentalists, and it's meanwhile sitting around leaking all over the place and ready to be stolen or whatever, all over the country, and they don't want to run it over the rails. And people don't want to go in through their towns, et cetera, et cetera. They also don't want their garbage burnt. And the landfills are ridiculous. The amount of garbage we produce is ridiculous. The oceans are full of plastics, and it's now coming up like you see in penguins with cigarette lighters sticking out of their bodies because they swallowed a cigarette lighter and thought it was something to eat or something. You've got so much plastic floating around the middle of the Pacific that you could dredge it forever and still never get to the end of it. It's up on the shores of the islands on the edge of Hawaii, on the little islands way out there. It's all over the place, and it's now getting incorporated into fish and everything else. It reminds me, you go back to the movie The Graduate when the guy says the secret to the future is this one word, plastics. If we had known, back then I remember we had glass milk jugs. Now they're plastic. Well, I mean, they would break and they could hurt people, but now you got the ocean full of plastic. I saw a guy the other day building the islands out of empty plastic bottles. I guess you could use empty plastic milk jugs too. Put them in mesh bags and build a wooden foundation over the floating mesh bags and build a house on the floating platform. I'm thinking, get some solar panels and get off the grid. That's the way to go. But I think I would be building steel reinforced concrete domes from this company, American Ingenuity. But we need 3 or 4 of those factories in every state, and that company needs to be franchised. And there's only one factory. It takes 6 months to build one hurricane-proof home. We had 50 years to build hurricane-proof homes on stilts in the Bahamas and all over the states. Instead, we built these stupid square homes, and the domes use 1/3 of the energy a regular house uses, and now we don't have the energy for all this electric crap we got. And Apple's coming out with a super fast 5G that you can charge for half an hour, and they're selling solar panel chargers. But if you have a nuclear winter or a volcanic winter, those solar power things aren't going to work. And if you have the economy collapse, the electric grid will be turned off. You won't have any electricity. So I won't be able to do this at all. I can't imagine. I'm looking at my picture here, and I've aged so much in the last year. It's ridiculous. You can't imagine me with black hair and thinner. I'm having trouble imagining myself. Well, anyway, they say to get fat's to get old, so I guess 67 is now old. But I was a lot younger last year before surgery. However, it got to be, this place isn't set up for me. I used to get on the highway. I could walk 30 miles in a day, and I could hitchhike 800 miles in a day on the interstate. And I'll tell you, the best people are the ones that gave me a ride. I was thinking of making a movie about a guy hitchhiking and a station wagon full of clowns go by waving at him. And I mean real clowns, dressed up like clowns. Because some people are jokers. Okay, well, I've been on long enough. I'm going to go. Started out about the Taliban. I'm so sick of hearing about the Taliban. As Ron Paul says, we could just walk out, declare victory, and walk out, and Trump could have his parade. And he said that before Trump had his parade. So I think that's what he ought to do. And talking about peace talks and all this crap is ridiculous. He's selling weapons to the Saudis, who are dictators, despots in Yemen, who are killing civilians there and starving 12 million people to death. And he's talking about some soldier that got killed last week. Meanwhile, the Israelis are committing genocide in Gaza. They're really behind this weapon sales to the Saudis to kill Shia in Yemen, because when they killed the Sunni army in Iraq, the Shia took over. The Kurds are a Shia tribe related to the Iranian Shiites. And since Israelis want to bomb Iran and kill Shiites, it looks like they're getting their way. We're also selling small arms to the Ukrainians who are fighting a civil war. There's two halves of Ukraine, a eastern half, a western half. There's a Russified half and a half that wants to join the EU. The EU really wants to go to war with Russia. So there's this proxy war going on inside, but we helped overthrow the elected government of the Ukraine. So it has a illegitimate government, and Putin says all of those former Soviet republics have illegitimate governments. And by the way, the Israeli KGB, the Israeli Mossad and the KGB helped get rid of Gorbachev and destroy the Soviet Union. The KGB didn't like Gorbachev because he wasn't a hardline communist. The Israelis didn't want friendly relations with us and the Soviets, because then we wouldn't need Israel as an ally anymore. And right now they don't want us friends with the Russians. But the Chinese have machinists to help us build a Saturn V. If I were president, I would take the Saturn V out of mothballs. I would update it, and I would ally with China and Russia. I would disband the EU. The CIA created it to control Europe as one entity. And Trump could get Congress to disband it and defund it and defund NATO. And therefore, he could prevent a world war if he knew what I know. And I'm just now telling you. So I've been thinking about this for some time. I started out a couple of months ago saying I'm running for president against Trump and all comers. I've studied ethics, philosophy, and East and West, and I have all the answers to the questions he doesn't know, including I've got a video on here. If you look up Masterless Master Trump and Masterless Master 911, 2 years before Romney lost the election, when Trump was supporting him, I put on here that he would never be president because the Protestants wouldn't vote for a Mormon because they don't believe Mormons are Christian. And that's on here, dated 2 years before the election that he lost, that Trump says he choked on the last month. He was the Leave It to Beaver candidate. The Mormons believe you got to baptize every member of your family by proxy, including everybody in the history of your family. That means they believe in the eternal soul and all this other stuff. Jesus denied three things: the established church of his day, the hypocrites, and the Pharisees. Everything today, precisely everything today that's called Christian. There was only one Christ, only one Christian, and he died on the cross. The apostles stole the body. I figure after the second day, they had to do it before the third sunrise, because first day they were too scared to do anything. The second, I figured at 4 o'clock in the morning, they went and took the body and burned it. What could you do with it? You couldn't put it in the water. It would come up. Somebody'd find it. Couldn't bury it in the desert. Somebody'd find it. So they burned it, and the smoke went up to the sky. That was the body ascending into heaven. And maybe they cremated Mary too. I don't know. But according to a Jewish woman here, there were no guards for the tomb. I always thought there was Roman guards. She said, why would they guard it? Which, if you think about it, didn't make much sense. And then I was just watching Orthodox Jews have to bury the body within 24 hours. So it was buried, but it didn't rise by itself. I think maybe Thomas wasn't involved. Maybe he came later, and they told him it was over there, and he went over there and raised the sheet, and he had holes in his hands and feet, and it was his body, but he was dead. So that could have happened. But as far as being the son of God. In Judaism, every man's the son of God. Every man's the first man. Every woman's the first woman. Every woman is Eve. And I never really believed in the immortal soul. And then when I found out Plato never proved it existed, that Socrates died claiming he believed in life after death or eternal life, but he didn't. He just said that so it looked like he was a martyr. So, as Nietzsche says, death is not an argument. Just because you die believing something doesn't make it true, and faith does not make blessed. So, there's a lot of reading. Took me, I'm 67. I've been reading books since I was 10. So, library books. I don't go to bookstores except when I was in college and teachers would give me the book list. I would go buy books, but all I have is books. I don't own land. I don't own a house. I'm not married. I don't have any children. I had one son somewhere back in '84 in West Virginia. He got kidnapped in '87. I haven't seen him since he was 2. Chad Everett Hudson. I don't know where he is. And I don't have a car. I don't use gasoline. I don't have any money. I have about $10 in the bank. And I'm going to write some books as soon as I get my computer fixed, which means I'm waiting on a mouse so I can use this recovery software to get my computer to work. But meanwhile, I'm going to sign off. This is Daniel Anthony Russo. I'm running as a Democratic Republican. I want to reunite the parties. I want to make the Bill of Rights a state religion. I want to establish 50 well-regulated state militias to provide for the common defense of the public, which right now we can't protect. The police are just there to clean up the messes, and they are not into prevention. I'm also into preventive medicine. I believe in. I think marijuana should have been legal a long time ago. It was made illegal by prohibition, along with a lot of other things. Heroin and cocaine used to be legal. Ron Paul says all these drugs should be legal. I think maybe the soft drugs, marijuana and LSD, maybe there's a few others, could be legalized. I don't know about heroin and morphine right now, but this OxyContin was so prevalent, people were, I mean, you can overdose on 100 milligrams of heroin, and 40 milligram OxyContins equals 140 milligrams of heroin. So people were overdosing on heroin after they got addicted to OxyContin. No wonder. So I don't care what they do as far as suing this family that overproduced this stuff. 76 billion oxycodone tablets. Now the police, I guess Trump's administration, Justice Department, forced the DEA to force the drug companies to tell where they shipped all those drugs to. They have now shipped them, and then the people died. So now they've got a map of where the drugs went and where the people died. They put those two together. I think there should be all these people who lost family members to OxyContin overdose should sue. I think North Carolina is suing, and 2 other states. I think all the states should sue. And I think it should be a giant class action suit. And Pfizer, by the way, in Merck, they made a drug that killed people as a side effect. They didn't take it off the market. And when Bush was president, he let the drug companies come in and their lawyers write the law to get a drug approved. You hire a committee. You pay the committee $500,000 to approve the drug. There's no oversight committee. So I pay you to approve the drug $500,000, you approve the drug. That's the way it went. Police think as long as the drug was legal, they won't try to even look at the case. They've been giving these children Vyvanse for attention deficit disorders. Turns out it's a amphetamine. It gets them addicted to amphetamines, and it has killed 564 healthy children. If you poison 564 children, you would be electrocuted or put to death or put at least in prison for the rest of your life. But these drug companies, whoever produced Vyvanse, never was even accused of murder. And the police, talk about Keystone Cops, I don't know what you call these guys. They're just plain stupid. So, be that as it may, I always heard they were regular guys, but I've always been above average. So, I was a National Merit Scholar in 1970. I was in the top half of 1% of the graduating seniors in high school back in the 70s for the whole United States. I really do look bad, but I'm really not as sick as my face looks. But I really can see where I need to lose. I really need to lose over 140 pounds. So I'm not doing any good just sitting here. I gotta go. Okay, adios, and I'll give you my 3 blessings. I hope you have good luck in everything you do the rest of your life. If you're not a wicked person who's killing innocent people, and I can't help you except if you change your life and turn into a good person and do good the rest of your life, but I can't force anybody to do anything. I hope you have good luck the rest of your life and everything you do. If you're a normal, everyday, happy person, or even unhappy person, I hope you become happy. But I hope you get everything you desire. That's your best dreams, your best wishes come true. Uh, out of all the possible ways of things working out for you, I hope everything works out for you in the best possible way. Make a list of what you really, really want, and I hope you keep it, carry it around, meditate on it. A good thing to think in case your mind is full of crap and you can't get rid of it. Just pray this thing over and over again. Lord, have mercy on my soul, or oh my Lord, or just till your mind is empty, and then something creative will grow. Your mind's like a garden. There's good things growing in it, and you get indoctrinated when you're little, you get weeds put in it. So if you forget everything you know, something creative will grow. And if your mind is freer, if you have more points of view, um, you can see the whole picture. Have more avenues to travel down, the more choices to make, the better. And if you think you have the permanent truth, you stagnate. Everything is changing constantly, so nothing is permanent. And everything shall pass, including this. I got to go. Bye bye. Good luck.